All right. Greetings, brothers and sisters. It's August 27th, 2024, 8:31 p.m. If you would, please come off mute. We'll open up with our motto. I'll just officially open up the meeting before we start the reading. One God,
One God,
one aim,
one aim,
one destiny.
one destiny.
Okay. Thank you, brothers and sisters. And tonight, UNIA-ACL Division 421 in Atlanta, continuing our study group, reading the text Race First. Tonight, we'll be reading chapter 10, Garvey and the Communists. Try to pace myself. Okay. Chapter 10, Garvey and the Communists. We have sympathy for the Workers' Party, but we belong to the Negro Party first, last, and all the time. We will support every party that supports us, and we appreciate the attention the Workers' Party has given us in sending this friendly communication. But the Communists have a long time. Hold on, please mute your lines.
Me too.
But the I messed up. We will support, okay, but the communists have a long time ahead of them before they can do anything for themselves in this country. When they get there, we will be for them. But meantime, we are for ourselves. Marcus Garvey. We are working with the Universal Negro Improvement Association, not because its president Marcus Garvey has improved enough or even changed at all in the last 2 years to suit our view of what the American Negroes must do to win their freedom. Has improved enough or even changed at all. Okay, as a matter of fact, the reason for our working with the Universal Negro Improvement Association is because we desire to win over the masses, organizationally and ideologically, following this association for the communist program. The Russian Revolution took place in 1917, 1.5 years after Garvey's arrival in the United States. The Communists, or Third International, was formed in March 1919 and was followed 6 months later by the birth of the communist movement in the United States. The year 1919 was Garvey's first year as a full-fledged international headache for white governments. After 2 years of persecution and factionalism, a large portion of the American communist movement surfaced as the Workers' Party in 1921. By this time, Garvey was an established leader of an unprecedented mass movement among African peoples all over the world. The bulk of Garvey's followers in the United States as elsewhere were workers and peasants. These were the types of people upon whom the communists would necessarily hope to build a mass movement. The necessity of winning over the Black workers and peasants would assume even greater importance for the communists when they belatedly awoke to the realization that the Black masses, as the most exploited section of American society, would have to occupy a critical position in their thinking if they were ever to seriously entertain any hope of overthrowing American capitalism. But between the communists and the American Black masses stood Garvey. They tried to infiltrate the UNIA by boring from within. They attempted to woo and win over Garvey himself. They tried launching frontal assaults against him in their press. They discussed him at their meetings from Moscow to Chicago. They even tried to plagiarize facets of his nationalistic philosophy, but they could not prevail. Garvey, displaying a great tact and political cunning, would not be compromised. He usually refrained from open denunciation of the communists, but he would not be co-opted. There seems to be no evidence of Black participation in the founding of the American Communist Movement in 1919. The program adopted by the Communist Party of America, one of the two founding factions, nevertheless included the following paragraph. The Negro problem is a political and economic problem. The racial oppression of the Negro is simply the expression of his economic bondage and oppression, each intensifying the other. This complicates the Negro problem, but does not alter its proletarian character. This statement, with its attempt to subordinate race to class, this statement, with its attempt to subordinate race to class, but with its uneasy realization that the racial factor complicated the Negro question, contained the basic elements in the central dilemma which puzzled communists in their approach to Black non-communist organizations in general, and to Garvey and the UNIA. I gotta get that from the 1 second. We should all have the text as well. So this is 222. All right. So let me back up. This statement, with its attempt to subordinate race to class, but with its uneasy realization that the racial factor complicated the Negro question, contained the basic elements in the central dilemma which puzzled communists in their approach to Black non-communist organizations in general, and to Garvey and the UNIA in particular. The question was not an easy one, and the difficulty faced by the communists in resolving it was understandable, especially since the analysis of these early American communists was restricted by a narrow interpretation of the orthodox Marxist doctrine of the primacy of class struggle. This rigidity in American communist analysis made difficult an objective analysis of the nationalist and racial components in successful ideology such as Garveyism. The solution to the race problem was seen as an automatic byproduct of a socialist revolution, and that was all. In 1920, the United Communist Party, representing a merger between one of the 1919 factions, the Communist Labor Party, and a split-off from the other faction, the Communist Party of America, showed this tendency in its program. It recognized that the Afro-American population was a super-exploited one and declared, the Communist Party will actively support the Negroes in their desperate struggle against these hellish conditions. It points to the only possible solution of the Negro problem, namely the abolition of wage slavery through the overthrow of the capitalist state and the erection of a communist society. The task of the United Communist Party is to break down the barrier of racial prejudice that separates and keeps apart the white and the Negro workers and bind them into a union of revolutionary forces for the overthrow of their common enemy. The Workers' Party, the legal, quote unquote, legal manifestation of American communism, which surfaced late in 1921, resolved in similar vein at its formation to show Black people that, quote, the interests of the Negro workers are identical with those of the whites, end quote. Nevertheless, by this time, the first feeble recognition in communist circles that the race question affecting Black people possessed a character other than a purely class one was manifested not in America, but in Russia. At the Second Congress of the Communist International Comintern, held in 1920, a white American delegate, journalist John Reed, volunteered some remarks on the national character of the Afro-American struggle. His remarks were prompted by a discussion of Lenin's ideas on, quote, the Negroes in America, end quote, which formed part of the draft, quote, these thesis on the national and colonial question, end quote. Reed's consideration of the national question, however, was merely to repudiate it. He said the Negroes have no demands for national independence. All movements aiming at a separate national existence for Negroes fail, as did the Back to Africa movement of a few years ago. They considered themselves, first of all, Americans at home in the United States. This makes it very much simpler for the communists. What is interesting about Reed's opinion is that Lenin ignored it and incorporated into his final thesis a statement far in advance of the position then being held by American communists. Because of the controversy which has surrounded this very brief reference, it will be quoted together with the whole paragraph from which it came, as well as the paragraph which came afterwards. Offenses against the equality of nations and violations of the guaranteed rights of national minorities, repeatedly committed by all capitalist states despite their democratic constitution, must be inflexibly exposed in all the propaganda and agitation carried on by the communist parties, both inside and outside Parliament. But that is not enough. It is only necessary first to make clear all the time that only the Soviet system is able to ensure real equity for the nations because it unites first the proletarians and then all the masses of the working people. In the struggle against the bourgeoisie, secondly, communist parties must give direct support to the revolutionary movements among the dependent nations and those without equal rights, e.g. in Ireland and among the American Negroes, etc., and in the colonies. One moment. Sip water, as Mr. Garvey teaches. Let's see, colonies. And I'll scroll down. We get ready to jump back in on 225. I'm almost finished with 224. Without this last particularly important condition, the struggle against the oppression of the dependent nations and colonies and the recognition of their right to secede as separate states remains a deceitful pretense, as it is in the parties of the Second International. It seems quite clear that Lenin was referring to the Afro-American population here, if not as a nation, then at least as a national minority denied equal rights and possibly having to succeed. That's interesting. That he should have taken such a position concerning Afro-Americans is not surprising, since he had for some time leaned in this direction in regard to national minorities. Now we're back here, national minorities in the Soviet Union. This may well explain why Garvey could maintain an admiration for Lenin while simultaneously fighting the American communists. Lenin followed up these themes with advice to his American comrades on the urgency of the need for propaganda and organizational work among Afro-Americans. The fleeting nature of Lenin's reference to the national character of the Afro-American situation and its unavailability in translation for some time ensured that there would be no immediate follow-up of this idea. During the final session of the Third Congress in 1921, however, the South American delegation proposed that the executive committee should study the, quote, the Negro question or the proletarian movement among the Negroes as important aspect of the Eastern problem, end quote. The Negro question was accordingly considered by the Fourth Congress in 1922. Right. These were introduced by Otto Huyswood, a Black member of the party in the United States who operated under the pseudonym Billings. They were adopted unanimously and revealed no change from the normal American approach. The Negro question was seen as primarily economic, though the racial question still played an important role. Huyswood considered the quote-unquote Negro problem to be, quote, a vital question of the world revolution, end quote, and the cooperation of Black peoples to be essential for the proletarian success. He suggested a world organization of the Black race which sounded suspiciously like Garvey list, like a Garvey list UNIA. Hoytwood considered the Afro-American population to be a likely source of manpower for the counter-revolution in the event of an uprising, not an uncommon opinion in early American communist circles, where the phrase quote unquote reserve of capitalist reaction was used to describe the Afro-American population. Reserve of capitalist reaction. An article appearing in the Soviet paper Izvestia 2 weeks before Huyswood presented his thesis, expressed a similar view. The black race was here seen as quote unquote an obedient weapon in the hands of international capitalism and hence a threat to the white proletariat. Comintern Congress discussions of the Negro question continued at the Fifth Congress in 1924. This time, the national characteristics of the Afro-American struggle intruded into the discussions. An American delegate argued that the problem confronting Afro-Americans was psychological as well as economic and transcended class lines. It was therefore futile, he argued, to direct the same literature toward Black and white workers. The Program Commission of the Congress grappled with this problem too and concluded that it was impossible to define the concept of nation in such a way as to adequately cover every national situation. None of this prevented American delegate John Pepper from denouncing the Garvey movement in typically unrealistic fashion as quote, a Negro Zionist movement in America which wishes to go to Africa, end quote, despite the desire of Afro-Americans for social equality. The most concerted attempt to clarify a communist position on the race question came at the Sixth Congress of the Comintern held in Moscow in 1928. By this time, Garvey had recently been deported from the United States, and the communists, with little to show for their previous efforts, were anxious to join the general rush for Garvey's followers. Much of their earlier confusion manifested itself but this time the debates culminated in the laying down of a definite policy. Stalin, as a long-standing Soviet expert on the question of national minorities, was largely responsible for the importance attached to the question. His interest had apparently manifested itself as early as 1925 when he explained to a group of Black students from the United States that the American attitude to the question was all wrong. Afro-Americans, he said, were a national minority with some of the characteristics of a nation. Preparatory work for the 1928 examination of the race question had well been in advance, and references to it appeared regularly from the earliest sessions. John Pepper admitted at the very beginning that American communists had made some mistakes, while another American retracted the idea that Southern Black people were a reserve of capitalist reaction. Nevertheless, the views expressed in the debates varied widely. Weinstone, a United States delegate, thought that the question could be solved by advancing slogans of full social and political rights for Afro-Americans. Pravda of August 24th, 1928, quoted Jones, a Black United States delegate, as saying that two tendencies had been expressed in the Negro Commission of the Congress. One argued that the Afro-Americans in the United States were a racial minority, while another denied the national unity of the Afro-American and pointed to increasing class stratification within the race, especially since the World War. This delegate also addressed himself to the suggestion for an independent Soviet Socialist Republic for Afro-Americans. He did not object to this idea, but considered a slogan. Let me see how long this. Oh no, this thing long. Ooh. Oh my goodness. This thing go to like 265. Yes, it's a chapter. A slogan for rights, a slogan for rights to be more fundamental at that particular time. Afro-American James W. Ford referred to United States blacks as an economically backward national minority having no territory of their own. This did not prevent him from arguing that the interests of black and white workers coincided, as did those of the black and white bourgeoisie. He therefore opposed, quote, at present, any national movement among the Negroes, end quote, since it would, quote, only be a trump in the hands of the bourgeoisie, end quote, and would, quote, trammel the revolutionary class war of the Negro masses and still more deepen the gulf between the whites and the oppressed groups, end quote. Let me get a little water.
You want me to pick up some?
Sure.
I'm actually back at the Taco Bell, but I'm in my car because the TNT thing just gave up when I got home. um, so the determination.
Sister Diane, you breaking up a little bit. Sister Diane, you there?
Hear me?
Yeah, you're breaking up quite a bit. I think we're gonna have to take care of it on this side. Sister Diane, you there? I think we lost Sister Diane. I will continue. Brother Mariam, are you available? She's calling back in now.
Okay, I'm actually driving now myself.
Okay, no problem. Folks on the road. Let me give Sister Diane 1 second. I'll get ready to continue.
Can't see this screen. Just collect black people move back.
Sister Diane?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can't hear you very
Can you
well.
hear me?
Yes, we can't hear you very well. You're breaking up pretty bad.
It says,
Sister Diane, we're gonna have to finish on yeah.
okay. Oh, it seems like now it seems like I can see. Can you hear me now?
We hear you a little bit now.
Are you hearing me? Okay. So try again. If it acts silly, I have to Okay, Sarah, we have. Okay. Okay, so
Sister Diane, you're breaking up again. Okay. Let's see. Okay, Sister Diane, I'm gonna have to continue, and I'll go see how far I can get. Um, one of such debate came, out of such debate came the new Comintern line of self-determination for the Black population in the quote-unquote Black Belt of the Southern United States. The new line was stated at length in a resolution of the Comintern's Executive Committee shortly after the end of the Congress. It pointed out that 86% of the Afro-American population lived in the South and that approximately half of these lived in the Black Belt, where they comprised more than 50% of the entire population. From this, it argued that, quote, the various forms of oppression of the Negro masses, who are concentrated mainly in the so-called Black Belt, provided the necessary conditions for a national revolutionary movement among the Negroes. The great majority of Negroes in the rural districts of the South are not reserves of capital reaction, but potential allies of the revolutionary proletariat. This belated recognition of the national character of the Afro-American struggle was thus limited to a question of territorial autonomy in this one area. Furthermore, the slogan of full social and political equality would remain the central slogan. The implications of Black nationalism for those outside the Black Belt, as demonstrated by Garvey, were ignored. The resolution noted that that due to, the resolution noted, as Garvey had long done, that due to worldwide imperialist oppression, quote, a common tie of interest is established for the revolutionary struggle of race and national liberation from imperialist domination of the Negroes in various parts of the world, end quote. The adoption of the 1928 national line of the Communist International is usually presented as having proceeded from Stalin's famous definition of a nation. And this it's interesting. There's a video of Dr. Tony Martin where he talked about the establishment of the provisional government of the UNIA, and he used Stalin's definition of a nation. So it's interesting to read it here in Race First after hearing what he said at a previous convention. Stalin's famous definition of a nation. Quote, a nation is an historically evolved, stable community of language, territory, economic life, and physical and psychological makeup, manifested in a community of culture, end quote. It is noteworthy that during the Congress debates, most American communists, Black and white, seem not to have advocated a national approach to the race question. George Padmore, at that time an active member of the American Party, later argued that the 1928 change had been motivated by the longstanding attempt to get at Garvey's followers. He wrote, quote, "It was therefore decided that since Marcus Garvey had rallied popular support by promising to establish a national home for blacks in Africa, the American communists should go one better and offer the American Negroes a state of their own in the Black Belt. It was hoped by this maneuver to satisfy the nationalist aspirations for those Negroes who still hankered after Black Zionism and turn them away from Garveyism to communism," he continued. With Stalin's blessing, this amazing piece of nonsense was imposed upon the American Party. The American Party certainly was not tardy in accepting the new line. Indeed, the Workers' Party issued a statement on self-determination simultaneously with the last stages of the Congress, prompted no doubt by the fact that 1928 was an election year in the United States, and the Workers' Party had several black candidates in the field. The statement read in part, "The Workers' Communist Party of American puts forward correctly as its central slogan, abolition of the whole system of race discrimination, full racial, social, and political equality of the Negro people. But it is necessary to supplement the struggle for the full racial, social, and political equality of the Negro with the struggle for their right of national self-determination. Self-determination means the right to establish their own state, to erect their own government, if they chose to do so. In the economic and social conditions and class relations of the Negro people, there are increasing forces which serve as a basis for the development of a Negro nation. A compact Negro nation, parentheses, a compact mass of farmers on a contiguous territory, semi-feudal conditions, complete segregation, common traditions of slavery, the development of distinct classes and economic ties." So describing black people in the South as a nation. These workers' parties, this workers' parties, yes.
Oh, I'm saying you was going in and out, President. I'm sorry.
Thank you for that. Let me see, make sure I'm out. Okay. This Workers' Party statement, much more explicitly than Comintern's statement, acknowledged though in a grudging fashion, the part that Garvey had played in inducing this new line. It continued. Okay, so I gotta go back to the book. Sorry, 1 second. 229, 230. So I'll read that top part again. The Workers' Party statement, much more explicitly than the Comintern statement, acknowledged, though in a grudgingly fashion, the part that Garvey had played in inducing this new line. It continued. There are many national movements of the Negro city, petty bourgeoisie, and intelligentsia. The fact that the most important mass movement was a sort of Negro Zionism and had such reactionary, extremely harmful slogans as leaving the United States and back to Africa should not blind us to the revolutionary possibilities of the Negro national liberation movements of the future. The resolution endowed Garvey with the measure of unintended legitimacy when it sought authority for the new national line in a Lenin quotation to the effect that all national liberation movements are bourgeoisie democratic. As the movement developed, though, they presumed that it would be taken over by proletarian elements. In 1930, in an effort to clear up once and for all the quote, lack of clarity on the Negro question, end quote, which they still recognize within the American Party, the political secretariat of the Executive Committee of the Communist International drafted a further resolution, quote, on the Negro question of the United States, end quote. This resolution recognized more clearly than before the peculiar features of the Afro-American nation. It stated, in the interest of the utmost clarity of ideas on the question in the interest of the utmost clarity of ideas on this question, the Negro question in the United States must be viewed from the standpoint of its peculiarity, namely as the question of an oppressed nation, which is in a peculiar and extraordinarily distressing situation of national oppression, not only in view of the prominent racial distinctions, material differences in the color of skin, etc., but above all, because of considerable social antagonism, remnants of slavery. This introduces into the American Negro question an important peculiar trait which is absent from the national question of other oppressed peoples. The resolution nevertheless continued to distinguish between Afro-Americans in the South and those in the North. It saw tendencies and prospects for the separateness as most likely in the South. Rather than self-determination, it saw the demand for equal rights as the more important slogan in the North, where it was, quote, under no circumstances the task of the communists to give support to bourgeoisie nationalism in its fight with the progressive assimilation tendencies of the Negro working masses, end quote. Yet it contradictorily admonished the party to, quote, resist all tendencies within its own ranks to ignore the Negro question as a national question in the United States, not only in the South, but also in the North, end quote. This resolution then was not itself a model of clarity. The distinction between South and North meant, of course, that some way had to be found around the uncomfortable reality of Garveyism, which had flourished both North and South, and which in 1930, 3 years after Garvey's deportation, still presented a formidable obstacle to communist work in the Black North. Garvey was accordingly smothered in a torrent of rhetoric, which was made to substitute for analysis. Despite the advocacy of self-determination in the Black Belt, even to the point of separation, communists were warned that they could not, quote, associate themselves at present or generally speaking during capitalism indiscriminately and without criticism with all the separatist currents of the various bourgeoisie or petty bourgeoisie Negro groups, end quote. For there was, quote, not only a national revolutionary, but also a reactionary Negro separatism, for instance, that represented by Garvey, end quote. This led up to a statement of the main objection to Garvey's nationalism, namely its racial exclusiveness. Having already stated the progressive nature of assimilation in the North, and it now drove home its attack on Garvey's, quote, utopia of an isolated Negro state, regardless if in Africa or America, if it is supposed to consist of Negroes only, end quote. Such a state would serve only the, quote, political aim of diverting the Negro masses from the real liberation struggle against American imperialism, end quote. So this then was the crux of their quarrel with Garvey. A separate Black-controlled state with the white minority would be supported in the Black Belt, even to the point of complete secession from the United States, and even if the state opted not to follow the communist program. But an all-Black Garvey state anywhere, even in America, would be utopian and reactionary. The point was reinforced by another party blast at Garvey. Quote, all national reformist currents, as for instance, Garveyism, which are an obstacle to the revolutionization of the Negro masses, must be fought systematically and with the utmost energy, end quote. American Trotskyists also grappled with the national question. Trotsky himself had, in 1922, impressed Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay as viewing the race question in a more intelligent fashion than any of the other Russian leaders. He had granted McKay an interview in Moscow and, among other things, and proposed training some Black men as Red Army officers. Discussing the national question in Mexico with American comrades in 1939, Trotsky adopted a position somewhat more amenable amenable to self-determination than most communists were wont to. He argued that the success of the Garvey movement was explicable in its propensities for self-determination. And rather than attack the petty bourgeoisie leadership of the race organizations, he preferred to see this phenomenon as a necessary stage in the emancipation of the race, necessitated by the racism manifested by white workers. He even envisaged the possibility, very unusual for communists at the time, that Black people, through the route of self-determination, might even leapfrog over the white proletariat and assume a vanguard role. He expressed this view as follows: "It is very possible the Negroes, also through self-determination, will proceed to the proletarian dictatorship in a couple of gigantic strides, ahead of the great block of white workers. They will then furnish the vanguard. I am absolutely sure they will, in any case, fight better than the white workers. That, however, can happen only provided the Communist Party carries on an uncompromising, merciless struggle, not against the supposed national prepossessions of the Negroes, but against the colossal prejudices of the white workers, and gives it no concession whatsoever." Communists usually tended to see Garvey in simplistic terms as a petty bourgeoisie figure, preaching reactionary nationalism and diverting the Black masses into utopian channels. There was obviously, as has already been seen, much more to Garvey than this inaccurate picture suggested. Much of Garvey's hold on the masses was due to ideas not very different from some espoused by communists. Despite his firm espousal of the race-first principle, for example, there was a persistent class component to Garvey's thinking. As against the white race, he saw the need for interracial solidarity, but intra-racial solidarity. But within the race, he demonstrated quite clearly that he identified with the oppressed masses against those with pretensions to more exalted status. Against a charge by W.E.B. Du Bois, against a charge by W.E.B. Du Bois that he was born in humble circumstances, he declared, quote, admitting that Marcus Garvey was born poor, he never encouraged a hatred for the people of his kind or class, but to the contrary, devoted his life to the improvement and higher development of that class within the race, which has been struggling under the disadvantage that Du Bois himself portrays in his article, end quote. UNIA members in New Orleans on one occasion eloquently expressed the same attitude. Quote, "We are not members of the Negro 400 or New Orleans," they wrote. Quote, "composed of the class that are spending their time imitating the rich whites." On occasion, Garvey even considered workers' revolts in white countries as an example for the Black race to follow. In 1926 editorial, he commented, "The royal and privileged classes of idlers who used to tyrannize and oppress the humble hordes of mankind are now experiencing difficulty in holding their control over the sentiment of the Black people." He thought that the Black man should also strike against royalty and privilege. He once went so far as to versify, "the downtrodden poor whites and Blacks to join and prevent rich whites our rights to purloin." The class appeal of Garvey's propaganda was recognized by a State Department official who considered it more dangerous than communism. This official wrote in 1921, "Though he is certainly not an intellectual, his particular propaganda and agitation is considered dangerous in that it will find a more fertile field of class divergence than Bolshevism would be likely to find in the United States," end quote. Nor was the race-first aspect of Garvey's philosophy difficult to explain in class terms. For it was based on a recognition that the overwhelming majority of the black race corresponded with the workers and the peasants everywhere. Garvey analyzed this situation in relation to his native Jamaica. Jamaica is a British colony with the population of nearly 1 million people. Of this number, more than 850,000 are black people. There are 15,000 white, and the rest are offspring of white and black colored people. In this population, there's a social arrangement whereby all positions of influence are held by a minority class. The bulk of the black people are kept in conditions bordering on serfdom. They are made up generally of the laboring class, who receives but a pittage of a wage ranging from 6 pence for a woman a day to 9 pence for men, for 1 shilling a day to 2 shillings. Because of this low scale of wage among the people, crime is rife. Our poorhouses are filled. 223. 233. If someone could pick up after page 233, that would be appreciated.
I could try again. I have a little more stability, it seems.
Okay.
But I'm not seeing the page. I'll just see. Just says page 223 is not. What does it say? I don't see the readings. Are you guys seeing the page?
I need you to pick up after page 233.
Gotcha.
So 233 reads, in the midst of this distress of the black majority, we have a preposterous minority of white, colored, and a few black persons who have been taken under the patronage of the privileged minority. Complimenting his sentiment for the masses, was an intolerance of privilege not too different from that of the communists. And Garvey's attack on the privilege extended to appropriate persons within the race, his race first doctrine notwithstanding. In 1924, for example, speaking against the candidacy of Black Harlem Republican Charles H. Roberts, he accused him of being backed by black capitalists and grafters. He went so far as to assert that, quote, as the white folks in the labor unions, the socialist group, and the progressive group are keeping their eyes on that selfish group of white people who are attempting to rob and exploit, so have you to keep your eyes on those selfish Negroes who have been crushing you for the last 20 years, end quote. He clinched his argument by explaining to his audience that you, the working man, have nothing in common with Dr. Charles Roberts at this time. On this occasion, Garvey's Negro Political Union actually backed a white candidate against Roberts. That's very interesting. Such hostility towards, that's very interesting. I think we should make a note. 233, the political position and how Garvey countered the race first position based on certain principles. Such hostility towards privilege extended quite naturally towards landowners. His election platform during his 1929 campaign for the Jamaica Legislative Council included suggestions for land reform. Recalling the experiences of his own uncle who had been a sharecropper and subject to the caprice of a dishonest landlord, he proposed methods to compel large landowners to make surplus land available to small holders. In the light of all this, it is not surprising that in the light of this, it is not surprising that he objected to the titles bestowed by the UNIA being viewed as a hankering after aristocracy. UNIA titles, he observed, were not based on wealth, but on service to the race. They were distinctions conferred on worthy individuals. We'll talk to Brother Mason about this. UNIA titles, he observed, were not based on wealth, on service to the race. They were distinctions conferred on worthy individuals by an appreciative race. These,
President John,
yes.
you need someone to.
Sister Diane is going to pick up. I got one more paragraph. These class sentiments on Garvey's part were enforced by a long history of struggle in and on behalf of workers' organizations. Communists and others who knew him only in the American context believed that his hostility toward white American labor unions was indicative of a general hostility towards workers' organizations. Yet, in his hostility to the racist practices of the American Federation of Labor, Garvey was acting no differently from the practically all Afro-American leaders, and indeed the communists themselves were, where he differed from them and expressed what they considered heresy was in his advice to the black working man, that he should have no compunction in playing on the capitalist greed by overselling the white workers and thereby obtaining employment. Sister Diane, are you going to pick up?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, employment. It seems strange and a paradox, he wrote. But only convenient friend the Negro worker or laborer has in America at the present time is the white capitalist. The position, however, was strictly in relation to the peculiar situation induced in America by racist white labor unions. In other situations, Garvey had a record of struggle in labor organizations that was undoubtedly more outstanding than that of many communist critics. His early involvement in worker struggle in Jamaica, Costa Rica, and Panama has already been noted. During the early Jamaican years of the UNIA, 1914 to 1916, 1914 to 1916, he attempted unsuccessfully to implement a scheme setting up employed workers as peasant farmers on crown lands. He also attempted in that period to enlist the aid of the Jamaican Federation of Labor. He maintained his interest in the Jamaica labor scene after moving to the United States. In 1920, during a police strike in Kingston, he upset authorities by dispatching a telegram expressing sympathy with his friend, A. Bain Alves, chairman of the Jamaican Federation of Labor, who had been very active in workers' struggle that year. Back in the Caribbean in 1921, Garvey advocated the unionization of Jamaica labor and labor sponsorship of. Sorry about that, my phone was trying to come in. Representatives to the Legislative Council. Garvey's most sustained activity in the labor movement came during his Jamaica period of 1927 to 1935. His Black Man newspaper became an organ for the exposure of labor grievances. In May 1929, a little over a month after its appearance, it took up the case of a young banana carrier who had been kicked and cuffed on the wharf by the assistant wharfinger. Garvey remonstrated with the other laborers on the wharf for not having thrown the culprit into the sea. When the man attempted to strike a few days later, he supported them. They therefore marched to his Edelweils Park headquarters and asked him to represent them in the dispute with their employers. The United States Fruit Company. Their wage was 1 shilling and 9 pence, 900 bunches of banana loads. Nor did they receive overtime for night work, Sundays or holidays. Garvey spoke to them on the necessity of unionization and condemned the social structure in Jamaica, as a result of which he declared, "A large number of you young people, my people, our race, form the unemployed. In view of the lack of an organization strong enough to sustain a strike and the easy..."
We got to go to the book for the next 2 pages. Does someone have access to the book?
Oh, I don't have my book with me. I left it. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm doing this from my phone.
I have
Okay.
what
Where it's fine? Or no?
Sounds like Attorney Motep is able to help us. Page 235 and 236.
36. Okay. Beginning at the last paragraph.
We starting at the top of 235. You can go from the last paragraph of 234 if you want to. Well, shoot, that paragraph kind of long, like half a page. But we're finishing up 234, going into 235.
Okay. We're at on 234, beginning which sentence?
We read the whole page of 234.
Let's see. Okay, top of page 235.
Yes, sir.
Availability of strike breakers. Garvey suggested that the laborers resume work while he negotiate on their behalf. During his negotiations with J.G. Kiefer, head of the United Fruit Company in Jamaica, Garvey extended his grievance to include the ragged and half-nude condition of female laborers on the wharf, whom he said formed a favorite subject for tourist photographers. Kiefer threatened labor-saving machines and boasted of his ability to break a strike. The Daily Gleaner, described by Garvey as the mouthpiece of special privilege and cold-blooded capital in the island of Jamaica, encouraged the adoption of the suggested devices, causing Garvey to warn its editor to keep his monstrous paws off the situation, lest the black man tell him where he ought to get off at, as it was always ready to tell him without any hesitation. The demand for a minimum wage was featured on the 1929 manifesto of Garvey's People's Political Party, and during his stay on the Kingston and St. Andrew Corporation Council, he regularly campaigned for an 8-hour day. Out of this, an allied activity, including a delegation to the governor and a petition to a visiting Imperial Sugar Commission, emerged his Jamaica Workers and Laborers Association, conceptualized as a body which would pave the way for unions rather than itself being a union. Garvey's interest in Jamaica's labor continued after his departure from Jamaica, and in 1938 he approved of the entry into politics of labor leader Alexander Bustamante, who was for the next 3 decades to play a central role in Jamaica's political life. Garvey's ubiquitous presence, as has been seen, was felt in workers' organizations in other parts of the world, such as Trinidad and South Africa. This involvement extended to yet other areas. In British Guyana, the UNIA maintained close contact with pioneer labor leader Hubert Critchlow and his British Guyana Labor Union. Similar links between the UNIA and worker struggles were reported from Barbados and the United States Virgin Islands. Indeed, it has been said by one active in the movement that most of the important working class leaders who emerged onto the political scene in the 1930s in the West Indies had been influenced by involvement to a lesser or greater degree in the Garvey movement. In Garvey, therefore, the communists were faced with an adversary whose knowledge of the Black working class, both from the standpoint of the UNIA and the standpoint of the labor unions, was very extensive, and Garvey's field of operation was truly universal as the communist was international. The bodies of thought represented by Garvey and the communists was deceptively similar. Both were, to a greater or lesser degree, anticipationalists and anti-imperialists. Both were anti-clerical, Garvey, of course, being at one and at the same time somewhat anti-clerical, but very much pro-religious. They both sought to organize around the great mass of workers and peasants, and they both all claims of the communists, to the contrary notwithstanding, had their fair share of petty bourgeois leadership, Bergio's leadership. Indeed, Garvey held better claims to a humble background than many of the communist intellectuals who glibly wrote him off as petty Bergioz. Both had, at least by 1928, come to recognize, though in varying degrees, the national character of the so-called Negro question. Between them, however, stood the vast chasm of race, just as the communists in their formulation of the nationalist question felt the need to hedge their attitude around with assimilationist requirements and thus withdraw from an acknowledgement of the primacy of the race factor. So Garvey, while recognizing the class character of society, always viewed it within the constraints of the race factor, which in his opinion overrode and transcended class differences. Thus, however, near the two bodies of thought might sometime appear to be, the race-class question presented a fundamental point of disagreement. These similarities and differences manifested themselves in practice in an intricate relationship of hostility interspersed with tolerance between UNIA and the communists, as all the while the communists tried to win over Garvey's following, and UNIA deftly avoided falling into communist hands. Some of the earliest contacts between communism and UNIA came in the persons of early UNIA members. The first editorial writer, apart from Garvey himself, of the Negro world was W.A. Domingo, a socialist. Domingo was responsible for some, at least, of the Bolshevik propaganda appearing in the paper, which alarmed authorities in 1919. He was, in the words of Garvey 6 years later, dismissed from my employ as editor of one of my newspapers because of his dangerous communistic principles. Another UNIA hanger-on was Cyril Briggs, who, though his African blood brotherhood, ABB, provided the American communists with some of their first black cadres. Still another was Otto Hall, a veteran of World War I. He sympathized with the militant industrial workers of the world, joined the UNIA in Chicago, and not long after the end of the war, became a member of the Universal African Legions. From there, he went into the ABB and later followed Briggs into the Communist Party. Communist attempts at capturing the UNIA began practically from the inception of the communist movement in the United States. The program of the United Communist Party in 1920 urged black communists to enter black unions, lodges, clubs, and churches to expose the reactionary leaders who, for the purpose of portraying their race, infest these institutions. Communists were urged, on the other hand, to support all radical black organizations. The UNIA was not specifically mentioned, but could not fail to have been considered under one of those two categories. In subsequent years, similar pronouncements encouraged infiltration into black organizations. The Fourth Congress of the Communist International in Moscow in 1922 urged support for every form of Negro movement which tends to undermine capitalism and imperialism or to impede their further progress. In similar vein, the Executive Committee of the Communist International in 1928 laid down the line of united front tactics for specific demands in dealing with existing Negro petty bourgeois organizations. The purpose of such tactics, it was clearly stated, should be to mobilize the black masses under communist leadership and expose and undermine their treacherous petty bourgeois leadership. Nor were the communists reluctant to consider utilizing bits and pieces of Garvey's programs and tactics. In 1921, a communist journal explained that the Negro has a great love of display, show, pomp, ostentation, brass bands, mysticism, decorations, buttons, social frivolities, and military display. In this regard, it is only fair to say that he is not alone. These contraptions catch his imagination and act as an inducement for organizations as nothing else can at the present time. This article suggested that such Afro-American aspirations of the free Africa, race equality, and the like should not be opposed but directed into effective channels. At the Fifth Comintern Congress in 1924, Israel Amter, an American delegate, even suggested linking Africa and Afro-America by sending pamphlets for distribution by Africa-bound sailors. One of the earliest attempts at infiltrating the UNIA came through the use of Cyril Briggs' African Blood Brotherhood. Though this attempt failed, Briggs and the Brotherhood would continue to be a source of harassment for the UNIA up to Garvey's death. Briggs organized the ABB in New York in 1919 and became its paramount chief. An immigrant from Nevis in the West Indies, he had previously been an editor of the New York Amsterdam News before being fired for the militant nationalism expressed in his editorials. During his sojourn as the Amsterdam News, he had toyed with various nationalistic solutions to the race problem, such as a separate state for Afro Americans in the West, or in Africa, South America, or the West Indies. This Crusader magazine, established in 1918 after his expulsion from the Amsterdam News, originally proclaimed itself the publicity organ of the Hamitic League of the World. The ABB was organized around this magazine, though never a large organization, 3,000 members at its height. It established branches in such places as Trinidad, British Guyana, and Santo Domingo, in addition to several locations in the United States. In 1921, Briggs also claimed the affiliation of 153 organizations such as churches in the United States, the West Indies, Africa, and elsewhere. The organization saw itself in the beginning as radical, though not communist. Perhaps in early 1921, if not before, Briggs was approached by American communists who thereby succeeded in obtaining a handful of recruits from the ABB. These recruits were some of the earliest Black communists in the United States and continued for long to be among the most prominent. They included, apart from Briggs himself, Richard B. Moore, Otto Hall, Lovett Fort Whitman, and Harry Haywood. Another outstanding Harlem socialist within the ABB was ex-Negro World editor W.A. Domingo. Domingo did not enter the Communist Party. Otto Hugheswood joined the ABB from the party. The ABB cadre proved a boon to the American communists at the time when the powers that be in Moscow were wondering at the absence of Black representation in the American movement. By 1922, the Harlem West Side branch of the Workers' Party was run by ABB members. Who's Wood, organizer, Briggs, recording and financial secretary, and persons described as comrades Moore, Campbell, and McCabe, members of the Propaganda and Educational Committee. On November 28, 1922, Hugheswood, masquerading as Comrade Billings, was praising the ABB at a session of the Commission on the Negro Question at the Fourth Comintern Congress. He distinguished the ABB from Garveyism to the detriment of the latter. Back in the United States, the communist workers saw in the ABB a great help in building a united front of Black and white workers. The first important task for the ABB in building this desired united front was to infiltrate the UNIA. This they attempted to do during Garvey's 1921 International Convention. Before the convention, possibly for tactical reasons, Briggs had taken a position moderately favorable towards Garvey. With the convention in progress, Briggs on April 15th dispatched a letter to Garvey, assuming for the occasion an attitude of due deference. He addressed Garvey as His Excellency, the Provisional President of Africa. He offered Garvey a proposition that Garvey, with his international mass movement, perhaps a million strong, should enter into a program of joint action with the ABB, an obscure organization of 1,000 or 2 for African liberation. But think of what we might be able to do for the race he cajoled. Through conscious cooperation, were we to adopt a program which would jointly represent us without any serious compromise on either side of important tactical points or principles. Briggs then took the opportunity provided by Garvey's assembled multitude to do a little recruiting for himself and passed around copies of the ABB program. The next ploy in Briggs' attempt to impose a communist united front on Garvey was to have his white communist friend Rose Pastor Stokes address the convention. She expatiated on Russia's desire to free Africa and on the need for black-white working class unity. She then called on Garvey to take a stand in relation to her communist overtures. Garvey was polite but non-committal. The final stroke in Briggs' strategy was to have ABB delegates to the convention introduce a motion for endorsement of the communist program. The motion was debated and tabled. ABB picked at this setback, then immediately published a Negro Congress bulletin on August 24th, almost entirely devoted to a scurrilous misrepresentation of the UNIA convention. This was brought to the convention's notice, and an explanation was requested from the 4 ABB delegates. Their names were called, but there was no response. An examination of the delegates' cards was about to be made when, in the words of the Negro world, a man was seen to rise hastily and scarily across the hall, plunged through the doorway, beating his way in precipitate flight toward 7th Avenue. The erstwhile indignant house rocked with laughter. It was then unanimously voted that the ABB delegate card should be withdrawn. Such a blunt and in many ways insulting power play could only have been due to political ineptitude on Briggs' part, but a disdain for Garvey's great knowledge of political infighting. In any event, Garvey used the ABB Bolshevism to justify his case against them, even though he praised Lenin and Trotsky during the same convention in a speech that urges hearers to do for Africa what Lenin and Trotsky had done for Russian overthrowing Kras's despotism. This distinction between Lenin and Trotsky, whom he usually endorsed, and American communists, whom he avoided, represented Garvey's normal position. Sometime later, he said, "I am against the brand of communist that is taught in America. In America, it constitutes a group of liars, plotters, and artful deceivers who twist a one-third truth to a whole big lie and give it out to the unthinking clientele for consumption. Communism among Negroes in 1920 and 1921 was represented in New York by such Negroes as Cyril Briggs and W.A. Domingo, and my contact with and experience of them and their methods are enough to keep me shy of that kind of communism for the balance of my natural life." Briggs, for his part, consoled himself on his defeat by arguing that Garvey had engineered his expulsion to prevent the ABB program from being officially represented to the delegates, whom he said were favorably disposed towards it. This turn of events meant that if even the communists desired for a united front with the UNIA but failed, the communists were assured of the next best thing, the cooperation of what were now some of Garvey's most vitriolic enemies. The Briggs-Garvey feud descended to its most acrimonious less than 2 months after the abortive ADB coup, when the Negro World carried an advertisement entitled "White Man Negro for Convenience." It read, "A white man in New York by the name of Cyril Briggs has started the African Blood Brotherhood to catch Negroes, no doubt. To make it succeed, he claims to be a Negro and continuously attacks the Universal Negro Improvement Association and its founder, Marcus Garvey. Negroes, take notice and govern yourself accordingly." With this indiscretion, Briggs, who was indeed light of hue, had Garvey arrested and tried for criminal libel, and Garvey reacted by showing Briggs's letter of cooperation to the judge. Briggs remained unmollified by a favorable decision. For the next months, Crusader was a veritable Garvey special. At least 10 of the 16 editorials that dealt with Garvey, as did several other articles. Readers were informed that Garvey had left his wife, that his father had died in a poorhouse, a point which was also utilized by Du Bois and the British government in anti-Garvey campaigns, that Briggs' letter to the Bureau of Navigation had met with a response suggesting that there was no record of 2 ships claimed by the Black Star Line, and more. He also quoted a Garvey statement acknowledging favorable comments on the UNIA from some European socialist publications to show that Garvey might have changed his mind since repudiating the ADB position on linking up with white workers for the liberation of Africa. One editorial even claimed that Garvey had raped a little white girl in a friend's office in England. With this last indiscretion, Briggs was in his turn arrested on a criminal libel charge brought by Garvey. At about this time, 3 high-ranking estranged Garveyites joined forces with the ADB. They were Cyril Cricklow, J.D. Gordon, a former assistant president general, and Bishop McGuire. The last 2 later returned to the UNIA. Their presence did not seem to help the ADB much. At a 1922 ADB meeting in Baltimore, for example, Garveyites resorted to one of their favorite tactics against enemy gatherings. They packed the meeting with UNIA members. They listened a while to the speaker, but as soon as he attacked the UNIA, he was met with the advice, "Stop there, brother. Don't you say any more." The police were called, but since the atmosphere was peaceful, they left. The Garveyites then turned it into a UNIA meeting. In 1923, Garvey accused the ADB of being implicated in the police raid on the New Orleans UNIA. Yet in 1924, Briggs acted as an agent for Garvey's Black Cross Navigation and Trading Company in helping it procure a ship. Garvey later attacked one of his own subordinates, William B. Sherrill, for having been responsible for this. Briggs' relationship with Garvey took another strange twist when in 1926, Briggs wrote a letter to the Negro World. This letter stated that Briggs was no friend of Garvey and had attacked him often. Nevertheless, he still had a letter from Garvey thanking him for supporting the First International Convention. He also indicated that he and ABB members W.A. Domingo and Richard B. Moore had attacked the Marcus Garvey Must Go campaign of Chandler Owens and his associates. Briggs even expressed sympathy for Garvey now that he had seen, he said, the incompetent help Garvey had in the management of his most recent steamship line. The main point of the letter seemed to be contained in Briggs' assertion that, to me, it is evident that the UNIA will soon be on the rocks unless some drastic change of control and policy can be effected quickly. And I believe it would be a great disaster to the race to have the UNIA disintegrate. Emphasis mine. This letter was published just 2 weeks after Garvey's attack on Sherrill for employing Briggs had appeared, and it was probably yet another communist attempt at UNIA co-option. Briggs' interest in the UNIA followed Garvey to Jamaica, including calls to Garveyites to join the Communist League of Struggle for Negro Rights. In 1931, Briggs published a lengthy analysis of the Garvey movement. Garvey was pictured as the usual petty bourgeois boogeyman who diverted revolutionary black nationalist sentiments into utopian reactionary back to Africa channels. The leadership of UNIA, he wrote, consisted of the poorest stratum of the Negro intellectual class element, struggling businessmen and preachers, lawyers without a brief, etc., who stood more or less close to the Negro masses and felt sharply the effects of the crisis. The undeniable mass followings built up by Garvey was contrasted with the small, advanced industrial proletariat who were experiencing the class struggle, presumably the ABB, for whom the UNIA had little appeal. Briggs also put forward here what has become something of a standard communist argument, namely that Garvey had been progressive and willing to struggle in the United States in the beginning, but that after his exclusion from the United States in 1921, he had taken fright and become party to an abject capitulation to the imperialists. In concluding, he recognized certain progressive achievements of the UNIA, one being the fact that it undoubtedly helped to crystallize the national aspiration of the Negro masses. Shortly after, the Negro world poked some fun at the communists' newfound position on the national question by suggesting that in adopting this position, Briggs was in fact preaching Garveyism. Briggs hotly denied this, claiming, among other things, that unconditional equality of the Negro people was alien to Garveyism. Briggs repeated many of his former charges against Garvey in 1932. Garvey replied immediately from the pages of his new Jamaican, which editorialized, as usual, we have been made the object of ridicule by the official organ, the Negro workers of the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, the Negro Workers. In their August issue, they have published an article below the name of one Cyril Briggs under the caption, How Garvey Betrayed the Negro. The editorial continued. Briggs has been a stubborn opponent of our rational method of the solution of the Negro problem in America. He and others have always tried to rope us in with communism. Briggs' antagonism remained unbridled in the face of Garvey's death. A premature obituary under the caption, Marcus Garvey dies in London, put out by Briggs' Crusaders news agency, announced in typical distorted fashion that during his stay in Jamaica, he made peace with the British imperialists and joined white employers in their attacks on Jamaican unions. This obituary was based on wrong information concerning Garvey's death. Garvey, in fact, died the following month.
Turn him accept. Oh crap. How much is it? Is it much more on this page? Because it's 10 o'clock now.
Yeah, yeah.
What page was that?
243.
Yeah, we can pick up where we lost. It's just 1 after 10. Getting late. Sister Diane, you there?
Yes,
That okay?
yes, we can pick up 243 on the next reading. Just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Thank everyone for their patience with the technical difficulties. Thank everyone who helped to participate with the reading. So on that note, as we are in the 10 o'clock hour, we'll go ahead and close out. And Brother Mariamar, if you want to take us out with something short and special, that'll be great.
Yeah, everyone. I just want to do the pledge to the red, black, and green.
Yes, sir.
The official pledge written by Beulah Wesley and Noni G and another sister whose name I can't recall. But it's important, so I figured we lead out with that. And no, it doesn't have to repeat after me. I'm just going to recite it. You put your hand over your heart. I commit my body, mind, and spirit to the protection, defense, and security of the red, black, and green. I dedicate my life to the redemption of Mother Africa and to the liberation of its scattered Black children. I accept for myself and my descendants the teachings of universal African nationalism and promise that our children will be instilled with the knowledge and purpose of themselves as African people, in order that the cause of our struggle would neither falter nor fail until all Black people are free and united through one God, one aim, one destiny.
Great job, Brother Mariamar.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
It's interesting. And y'all know why, officers. President Ross just got on us today. He was just asking us in our group text, how many of us know the pledge to the red, black, and green flag by heart? And not many of us were able to say that we could do it. So thank you, Brother Mariamar, for
That was timely. Thank you so much. Awesome. So on that note, I guess we can move to close out. You have anything to add, Brother John, to that?
No, ma'am. I think that was perfect. We can do the motto and the slogan if you like.
Okay. All right. Everyone, put your black fist in the air. Repeat after me. One God,
One God,
One God,
one aim,
one aim,
one destiny.
one
one
destiny.
destiny.
Africa
Africa,
Africa
for the Africans,
for the
for
African.
the Africans,
those at home
Those
those at home,
and those abroad.
and
and
those
those abroad.
first.
Race first,
Race
peace
first.
and love